This is the BBC.
Hello and welcome. It's another Confessions podcast from your friends at Radio 2. Oh, I've got some space here, haven't I? This is ID Wow Ramp. I could have spoken over this bit, but I didn't rehearse it.
88 to 91 FM.
Got there in the end.
BBC Radio 2.
So, this week's Concise Collection features Landing of Confusion, Smooth Operator, as a painful one that is, Flavour of the Old School, and Run Rabbit Run. Here they all come. Father Simon and the Underlings.
What?
Sorry, I'm just saying.
Yeah, this is going to go well.
This is from
That's all
Richard.
right.
Richard.
Well, my guess is that you're not...
Not forgiven, already writing it down. Yeah.
Actually, I think you're probably right. After many years of working within the industry, Father Simon, I feel it's time to confess something from my cabin crew days that has sat heavily on my guilty heart for a long time. As I'm sure you know, us cabin crew are on aeroplanes for a lot more than simply serving drinks and snacks. We're highly trained in many aspects of safety and can put out fires, break up fights, save your life, deliver babies, and of course, should the worst happen, get you evacuated from an aircraft that finds itself in an emergency situation. The training is intense and difficult. Many people fail. But those that make it through the grueling 7-week course eventually make it onto an aircraft to do their first ever flight with real-life, full fare paying, genuine passengers. However, the other thing to know is that when one joins an airline, there is an unwritten rule that the person should be initiated in a way that fully immerses them into the working world of trudging about on planes 6 days a week. One such day in 2006, I was the purser when we were taking an aircraft out to Rome, and we had a newbie on the crew, a 19-year-old girl, let's call her Alice, fresh-faced and smiley and brimming with enthusiasm. Perhaps she had a little bit too much enthusiasm. Some might say she was a little overconfident in her role. Shiny and new out of training, Alice thought she knew it all. No problem was too much for her to deal with, and she had an answer for every passenger and crew member on the aircraft. She knew the exact route, she knew the exact speed of the aircraft, she was far too aware of every minutiae of the service we were to deliver to our passengers. She was, to put it bluntly, really rather irritating. Now, the usual first aid pranks were pretty standard. We'd tell newbies that we were having a customs inspection on landing, so it was essential they should count every sugar sachet on board. We'd replace the safety demonstration life jacket with a real one, which would blow up instantly when they pulled the red toggle during the pre-flight briefing. We'd delicately balance a cup of water above their seat so that it would fall on them as the aircraft landed. I could go on, but they're all harmless fun. I knew, however, I'd have to get Alice with something special, and I concocted a plan with Simon, the captain, who was always up for a prank, much like Matt always is.
Oh,
He's
yes.
full of...
Already putting my black hat on
James.
for this one. Yeah, go on.
Now, normally on a short-haul flight, the pilots give us heads up over the PA when we have 10 minutes to landing, so we can start to prepare the aircraft. However, on this occasion, Captain Simon gave us 10 minutes to landing, and he gave the call 15 minutes to landing. Now, this was phase 1 of his evil scheme, and all the other crew knew exactly what was happening. Everyone except Alice. So we prepared the aircraft for landing as normal and then took our positions in the jump seats ready to land. However, we didn't land, we continued to fly. Alice looked confused in her seat, glanced at her watch, expecting to hear the aircraft gear lower, which would mean we had about 90 seconds to land. No such noise came. Playing my part, I popped into the flight deck, where all was well and normal, except the sly and deceitful smile on mine and Simon's face. Returning back into the passenger cabin, I walked hurriedly down to Alice's seat, and with a worried expression on my face, I explained to her that there was a problem with the landing gear. I told Alice that as the most junior member of the crew, we would need her to try and help dislodge it.
What?
She was to head to the middle of the aircraft, just behind the wings, in the middle of the aisle, and jump up and down in the middle of the cabin as hard as she could to try and dislodge the stuck landing gear. Now, obviously, in these situations, we didn't want to alarm the passengers, so if any one of them were to ask what she was doing, I told Alice to say, "These are my judo exercises that I like to do every day. You should try them once we've got back into the landing craft."
Once you're on ground,
That's the
perhaps. Yeah.
Alice looked horrified. The perfectly made-up face drained of colour and her overly smarmy demeanour vanished instantly. But clearly keen to save the day, she did as she was asked. She walked to the middle of the passenger cabin and, without saying a word, jumped up and down as forcibly as she could, stamping. Several passengers turned to see what was going on. Her hair fell loose from her perfectly coiffured donut. Sweat began to form on her foundation-stained brow. A good 30 seconds passed of Alice jumping up and down in the middle of the aisle, and still the gear hadn't dislodged. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew and I were hiding behind a curtain. The galley, that's where we were, crying with laughter and doubled over. A peek round the curtain a few seconds later showed Alice to be on her hands and knees, banging the airplane floor with her hands, screaming, "Come on! Come on!" This was far too much for us to bear. We collapsed into uncontrollable laughter. Thankfully, at that moment, Simon did lower the landing gear, and Alice, convinced she'd performed a truly heroic deed that had brought us all back from the brink of certain doom, began some mild hysterics, high-fiving passengers as she shakily returned to her seat. Her face was the epitome of relief and jubilation. Of course, the aircraft was fine. Our passengers disembarked. Alice took a moment to compose herself. So I seek forgiveness not from Alice, who still to this day has no idea that the whole thing was a massive prank. Nor do I seek forgiveness from the passengers, some of whom may have thought that the aircraft was staffed by a crew with a nervous disposition. And I seek forgiveness today from the engineers back at our base, who, when we landed back home that evening, had to replace the carpet in the aisle where Alice had made so many rips and tears from her incessant jumping and pounding. Now, I reckon I'm fairly attuned to the way these things are going to go.
Yeah.
So, and I already know that Matt doesn't like it just because he was referred to as an underling, which never goes down very well. Plus, I take a look at Bobby and I'm going, let me just take a look at Bobby now. Oh, Face of Thunder is what I'm looking at. Because I actually think Richard was slightly put out by how clever and smart Alice was and couldn't cope. Anyway, let's check in with Sister Bobby from the Priory.
Yeah, well, the thing is, work hijinks are a common thread through the confessions, and we love them generally. The thing is, you're on a plane, and that puts hijinks in a completely different situation, because you're in a plane, you're in a tin can in the air. So I'm really worried about hijinks when you're in a tin can in the air, regardless of the physics. The other thing I'm a little bit concerned about is, doesn't Alice know how her plane is put together? Doesn't she know that she's banging up and down on the wrong floor? That actually the floor of the cabin is not the floor of where the landing gear is. It's going to have a little impact. I'm more worried about why Alice is in charge of safety of all of us, actually. That concerns me. Richard, you are unforgiven. You don't mess around in planes.
Go on then, Matt.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm going to go along with Bobby on this. Number one, I think for this gag to work, the passengers needed to be in on it, because you're on this plane, and if I was on a plane and somebody started jumping up and down in the middle, I'd be a little perturbed. So in order for it to be funny, everyone else needs to be in on it as well as, and not her. And also, landing gear, obviously, is at the front of the plane, and at where else? It's on the wings, isn't it? It is on my toy one. Where else are the... Anyway, the wheels are not in the middle of the plane. On the